My blood reacts to you. The silver fork froze midair. Julian Crowe, the vampire king whose name commanded the ancient court for 3 centuries, stared at the young woman standing beside him. Her hand was steady despite the fear crackling in her eyes, her palm raised toward his, a vibrant crimson aura pulsing where their skin nearly touched. He blinked once, then slowly, almost wearily, followed the glow. There it was. The impossible resonance, the blood signature that hadn't manifested in his presence since the night he turned away from the only woman he ever loved. The same power he thought had died with her 20 years ago. The moment stretched thin. The dining hall buzzed around them, ancient bloodlines conversing in hushed tones, crystal glasses catching candlelight, the low rustle of velvet and silk. But at the king's table, everything stopped. Julian slowly lowered his fork. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dana took a step back, her serving uniform brushing the edge of the ornate tablecloth. Her hand still gripped the wine decanter tightly, but her words were already out, hanging in the air, heavy. I didn't mean to disrespect the court," she said quickly. "It's just... My mother used to say, if your blood ever glows for someone, you hold a piece of their soul. And yours. It responded to mine." Julian's gaze sharpened. Luke Ashcroft, his confidant seated to his right, leaned in immediately, hand moving toward the concealed blade at his waist. Julian raised one finger, a silent command to stand down. He just looked at Dana. Not angry, not amused, but stunned. His lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. The blood aura between them flickered once more, then faded. Dana nodded, swallowed her breath, and stepped away. She turned toward the servants' corridor, the murmur of the court crashing back into her ears. She felt the eyes on her, some curious, some hostile, others calculating. She kept walking. Behind her, Julian watched her go. His shoulders had stiffened. His hand drifted to his chest, where beneath layers of formal attire, his own blood thrummed with recognition. He hadn't thought about Lorie in years, had forbidden himself from thinking about her. And suddenly, her name slammed into him like a stake through the heart. Lorie Bowman, the Human District, 2005, the girl with paint-stained fingers and eyes like morning light breaking through fog. The girl his court said would destroy their ancient order. The one he had let walk away because he hadn't had the spine to defy 3 centuries of tradition. The one who had vanished from his life just months after they'd said goodbye at the border between their worlds. She'd never told him she was pregnant. He never knew. Now here was this young woman, her voice, her posture, her defiance. And something deep inside him, something he thought had calcified into stone centuries ago, shifted. Could it be? But no. It was impossible, wasn't it? He didn't speak again for the rest of dinner, and Dana, back in the servants' quarters, stood silently at her locker, numb to the reprimand the head steward was delivering. Words like protocol violation and execution-worthy offense and the king's mercy is not guaranteed drifted in and out. None of them stuck. All she could think about was the look in the king's eyes. Not rage, recognition. The kind of look you give a ghost you thought you'd buried. That night, as the winter wind howled through the narrow streets of the Human District, Dana sat alone in her small apartment. She didn't cry. She didn't call Valerie yet. She just stared at the small photograph taped to the corner of her mirror. Lorie, age 23, holding baby Dana in a hospital gown. She reached into her nightstand and unfolded the yellowed envelope with no address. A letter her mother had written but never sent. To the one who never knew. If our daughter ever finds you, please be kind. Please be better than silence. Her blood carries both our legacies. Don't let her bear that weight alone. Dana's voice cracked as she whispered to the empty room. I think I found him, Mom. And somewhere across the city, in the obsidian tower that housed the vampire court, Julian Crowe stood alone in his private chambers. Moonlight spilled through the Gothic windows, casting silver across his left hand. He stared at his palm, at the faint crimson glow still lingering beneath his skin. And for the first time in 2 decades, his heart whispered a name he thought he'd carved from his memory. Lorie. In that silent exchange, between a girl holding on to her mother's final words and an ancient king finally facing the weight of all he had abandoned, something unspoken began to wake. Like this if you support Dana in claiming the acknowledgement her mother never received. Subscribe to see how a single whispered truth can shatter centuries of silence. Julian hadn't left his chambers since the court dinner. The city outside his tower windows pulsed with nocturnal life, vampires moving through shadowed streets, the distant glow of the human district beyond the wall. But inside, everything was still, like the moment between death and resurrection. He hadn't fed, hadn't answered the summons blinking on his communication stone. He just stood at the window, one hand pressed against the glass, the other absently tracing the place where Dana's blood aura had touched his. That girl, Dana. Her voice hadn't left his mind. Her face haunted him. And that name, Lorie Bowman. He hadn't said it aloud in 20 years, not since the summer she disappeared. He closed his eyes, and the human district came rushing back. Humid evenings, Jasmine climbing brick walls, and Lorie standing barefoot in the secret garden where their worlds overlapped. She used to hum when she painted. Watercolors, mostly, soft colors, apologetic strokes that grew bolder the more time they spent together. He loved that about her, how she learned not to apologize for being visible until the court elders discovered them, until he was summoned to the grand chamber and told in no uncertain terms, "You will not disgrace 3 centuries of rule with this entanglement. The law is absolute. Humans and vampires do not bond. They do not breed. They do not dilute our bloodlines." He didn't fight it. He convinced himself it was duty, that it was for the greater stability, that love was a luxury kings couldn't afford. Lorie had left the district without a word a few weeks later. He never knew why, never had the courage to find out. Until now. He moved to his desk, hands stiff with centuries of repression. He activated the encrypted archival search, the one only the king could access. He typed her name slowly. Lorie Bowman, Human District Registry. A few records appeared. Then one file made his breath catch. Death certificate. 12 years ago. Cause: hemorrhagic fever. Survived by one daughter, Dana Lorie Bowman. Father unknown. His hand clenched into a fist, cracking the edge of the stone desk. He opened the attached image file. It was her. Older, yes. Thinner. But those same eyes. That same slight smile that never quite reached sadness. At the bottom of the record, final residence, East Quarter, Human District. Buried at Moonvale Cemetery. He closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and whispered into the darkness. She never told me. The knock at his door came 3 hours before dawn. Julian didn't move. Enter. Luke Ashcroft stepped inside, closing the door with deliberate care. The confidant's expression was unreadable, but his posture spoke volumes. Shoulders tight, jaw set. The court is asking questions. Let them ask. They want the girl executed. Standard protocol for servants who breach. No. Julian's voice cut through the room like a blade. Luke went silent. Then, quieter. What happened tonight? Julian turned from the window, and for the first time in decades, Luke saw something in his king's face he didn't recognize. Vulnerability. Her blood resonated with mine. The words landed between them like stones in water. Luke's eyes widened. The royal resonance hasn't manifested since Lorie. Julian's voice cracked on the name. The girl is her daughter, Luke. Which means she's yours. The confirmation hung in the air, undeniable. Julian's shoulders sagged, the weight of 20 years of silence finally pressing down. I need you to confirm it. Quietly. No records leave this tower. Find out everything. Where she's been, how she survived, why Lorie never... He couldn't finish. Luke nodded slowly. And if the court discovers what you're doing, then I'll deal with the consequences. Julian's gaze hardened. But that girl, Dana, she risked execution to speak the truth. The least I can do is face it. Luke studied him for a long moment, then bowed. I'll have answers by nightfall. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I think she has your eyes. The door closed softly. Julian stood alone again, staring at the place where Dana had stood hours before, where the impossible had become real, where the past he'd buried had risen from the grave, wrapped in crimson light and 20 years of silence. He pressed his palm flat against the table, and for just a moment, the faintest glow pulsed beneath his skin. His daughter's blood calling to his, a bond he never knew existed, a legacy written in the language of forbidden love. Lorie, he whispered to the empty room, what have I done? Dana's apartment smelled like old books and lavender tea, the kind of place that felt like a refuge, walls lined with secondhand novels and her mother's unfinished paintings. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, birth certificates, hospital records, her mother's journals, all the fragments of a life that had never quite made sense until tonight. Valerie paced near the window, her violet eyes catching the streetlight. She'd arrived within an hour of Dana's frantic call, no questions asked, just a duffel bag full of ancient texts and a determination that made Dana's chest ache with gratitude. Read this again, Valerie said, crouching beside her. She pushed forward a weathered leather tome, its pages brittle with age. The heading read, Sangus Regalis, the Royal Resonance. Dana's finger traced the faded ink. A blood bond exclusive to the royal lineage. When two beings share genetic heritage through the throne's bloodline, their essence resonates in proximity, manifesting as visible aura. The phenomenon has not occurred in recorded history outside direct royal succession. Direct royal succession, Valerie repeated, letting the words settle. Dana, do you understand what that means? Dana's hands trembled. It means the king is my father. The words felt too big for the small room, too impossible, too devastatingly real. Valerie sat back on her heels. Your mother never told you anything about him? She said my father was someone she loved but couldn't keep. Dana pulled out a photograph, Lorie at 23, standing in a garden, her smile soft and sad. She said he lived in a different world. I thought she meant metaphorically, that maybe he was rich, or married, or just gone. Not metaphorically. Valerie's voice was gentle. Literally a different world, the vampire court. Dana stood abruptly, moving to the window. The city sprawled below, human district to the south, the obsidian towers of the court rising to the north like dark sentinels. Two worlds, separated by blood and law and centuries of fear. My mother died 12 years ago, Dana said quietly. Hemorrhagic fever, they said. But I remember the doctors whispering. They said her blood was incompatible with the treatments, that her immune system was attacking itself. She turned to Valerie. What if it wasn't fever? What if it was the bond? Valerie flipped through. Another text, scanning rapidly. She stopped on a page marked with a red ribbon. Here, the severed bond. When a human bears a child of royal blood without the completion of the mating ritual, the human body experiences progressive deterioration. The bond, once severed by the vampire's rejection, leaves a wound that cannot heal. The words hit Dana like a physical blow. He left her, and it killed her. We don't know the circumstances. I know he wasn't there. Dana's voice cracked. I know she raised me alone. I know she worked 3 jobs and painted in the hours before dawn because that was the only time she had. I know she told me bedtime stories about a king who forgot how to love. Her throat tightened. I thought they were fairy tales. Valerie crossed the room, pulling Dana into a fierce hug. For a moment they just stood there, 2 young women holding on to each other in a world that had suddenly grown infinitely more complicated. When they finally pulled apart, Valerie's expression had shifted into something sharp and determined. So, what do you want to do? Dana wiped her eyes. What do you mean? The king knows about you now. The resonance proved it in front of the entire court. He can't ignore this. He can't pretend you don't exist. Valerie's gaze was steady. But you have a choice here, Dana. You can walk away. Change your name. Leave the city. Disappear like your mother tried to, or I can make him answer for it. The words came out harder than Dana intended, but they felt right. Felt true. Her mother had spent 20 years in silence, carrying the weight of a love the world said was impossible. She'd died with that silence, her name erased from every record, her daughter marked as fatherless. He's the king, Valerie said carefully. If you challenge him publicly, then he'll have to choose. Dana's voice was quiet but steel-edged. Between the throne and the truth. Between his duty and his daughter. Let's see which one he picks this time. Valerie studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black tablet. Then we're going to need leverage. If you're going to confront a 300-year-old vampire king, you need to be untouchable. Which means we need proof. Not just the resonance, but documentation. Birth records. Your mother's residency permits. Anything that connects Lorie Bowman to the court. Dana moved to her mother's desk, pulling open the bottom drawer. Inside was a wooden box she'd never been able to open, the lock too intricate, the key long lost. She'd always assumed it held paintings or letters. Now, looking at it, she wondered. Help me with this, she said. Valerie joined her, examining the lock. After a moment, she pulled a thin pick from her keychain. My brother taught me, she explained with a small smile. Don't ask. The lock clicked. Dana lifted the lid with shaking hands. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all addressed in her mother's handwriting but never sent. And beneath them, a single photograph. Lorie standing beside a young man with dark hair and eyes the color of winter storms. They were holding hands in a garden filled with white camellias. On the back, in faded ink, Julian and Lorie. The night we promised forever. Dana's breath caught. She turned the photo over again, staring at the man's face, at the sharp jawline, the guarded expression that couldn't quite hide the softness in his gaze when he looked at her mother. That's him, Valerie whispered. Dana nodded slowly. That's my father. And in that moment, holding proof of a love that had been buried for 20 years, Dana Bowman made a decision. She would not be silent. She would not disappear. She would walk into the king's world and demand the one thing her mother never got. Acknowledgement. Luke Ashcroft had served the vampire court for 73 years. He'd seen kings rise and fall, witnessed blood feuds that lasted centuries, survived 3 court purges and a civil war. He considered himself unshakable, but standing in the secure archives beneath the court's foundation, staring at a file that shouldn't exist, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Doubt. The archive chamber was silent except for the hum of preservation spells keeping centuries of records intact. Row upon row of crystalline tablets lined the walls, each one containing bloodline registries, birth records, death certificates, the entire genetic history of the court. Luke had clearance to access most of it. But what Julian had asked him to find required breaching the sealed registry, the section reserved for the king's eyes alone. He'd done it anyway. Loyalty demanded it. Now he wished he hadn't. The holographic display floated before him, pale blue text suspended in darkness. Human District Census, 2005-2006. Cross-reference. Court personnel unauthorized contact logs. He'd spent 6 hours filtering through thousands of records, searching for any mention of Lorie Bowman. What he found made his chest tighten. Entry dated August 14, 2005. Unauthorized crossing detected. King Julian Crowe. Destination, Human District East Quarter. Duration, 4 hours, 23 minutes. No incident report filed. Another entry, September 3rd. Unauthorized crossing detected. King Julian Crowe. Destination, Human District East Quarter. Duration, 6 hours, 47 minutes. No incident report filed. The entries continued. September, October, November, December. 47 unauthorized crossings in 5 months. All to the same location. All meticulously hidden from court record by someone with the power to erase their own movements. Luke scrolled deeper. January 2006. The crossings stopped abruptly. And 3 weeks later, a new entry appeared in a different file. Human District Emergency Medical Records. Patient, Lorie Bowman, age 23. Condition, advanced pregnancy, complications, admitted to St. Mercy's Charity Hospital. Note, patient claims father is unable to be present. No paternal acknowledgement filed. Luke's jaw clenched. He pulled up the birth record. Dana Lorie Bowman. Born February 18, 2006, 3:47 a.m. Mother, Lorie Bowman. Father, unknown. Unknown. The word was a lie, and everyone who'd filed that report knew it. He dug further, accessing medical records that required 3 layers of encryption to breach. Lorie's hospital file opened before him, and what he read made his blood run cold. Genetic anomaly detected in infant. Blood composition shows markers consistent with Class S supernatural heritage, flagged for court investigation. Investigation order, sealed by royal decree. File classified. No further inquiry permitted. Someone had known. Someone high enough in the court hierarchy had discovered the child existed, flagged her as a hybrid, and then buried the evidence. And the only person with authority to seal a file at that level was the king himself. Julian had known about Dana. Maybe not immediately, but at some point in the past 20 years he'd found out. And he'd chosen silence. Luke closed the files, his hands shaking with something between anger and betrayal. He'd served Julian faithfully for 7 decades. He'd believed in his king's judgment, his integrity, his commitment to the court's survival. But this was cowardice, dressed as duty. He gathered the evidence crystals, slipping them into a secure case. The physical proof Julian had demanded, proof of paternity, proof of abandonment, proof that the king who preached about ancient law and bloodline purity had broken every rule he claimed to uphold. Luke made his way through the archive corridors, past the sleeping guards, back toward the surface. Dawn was 2 hours away. He'd promised Julian answers by nightfall, but he couldn't wait that long. This truth had already festered for 2 decades. Every additional hour felt like another betrayal. He reached Julian's chambers just as the first hint of pre-dawn gray touched the horizon. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and stepped inside. Julian stood at the window, exactly where Luke had left him hours before. He didn't turn. "Tell me." Luke set the case on the desk with more force than necessary. "She's yours. Confirmed through genetic markers in the hospital records. Born February 18, 2006. Lorie Bowman died 12 years ago from complications related to a severed supernatural bond. His voice was cold, clipped, professional. And you already knew." That made Julian turn. "What?" The file was sealed. Royal Decree, January 2006. Luke's eyes blazed. Someone in the court discovered Dana's existence when she was an infant and flagged her as a hybrid. The investigation was shut down by direct order from the throne. That's you, Your Majesty. So either you knew and chose to do nothing, or someone acted in your name, which means you've lost control of your own court. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Julian's face had gone ashen. I didn't know about the file. I swear to you, Luke, I didn't. He stopped, something dawning in his expression. The elders. They must have discovered it. They would have buried it to prevent scandal. Then they've been lying to you for 20 years. Luke's voice softened slightly, but the edge remained. Julian, this girl, your daughter, she grew up believing she was fatherless. Her mother died alone, probably because you severed the bond when you walked away. And now she's risked execution just to tell you a truth you should have fought for 2 decades ago. Julian sank into his chair, looking suddenly ancient, more tired than Luke had ever seen him. What have I done? You chose the throne. Luke's words were blunt but not unkind. You chose stability over love, duty over family, and maybe 20 years ago, that was the right choice for a king. But that girl standing in the court 2 nights ago, she didn't choose any of this. She just wants to know why she wasn't enough. Julian's hands covered his face. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. How do I fix this? Luke looked at the evidence case, then back at his king, at his friend. You can't fix it. You can only face it. And you'd better decide soon, because the court elders are already calling for her execution. If you want to save your daughter's life, you're going to have to choose her publicly. Which means risking everything you've spent 3 centuries building. He turned toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I think she's worth it. But that's not my decision to make. The door closed softly behind him, leaving Julian alone with the weight of 20 years of silence and a choice that would change everything. Outside, the sun began its slow climb toward dawn, and somewhere in the human district, Dana Bowman slept with her mother's letters clutched to her chest, dreaming of acknowledgement she wasn't sure would ever come. Dana posted the blog at 3:47 a.m., the exact time she'd been born 23 years ago. The symbolism felt right, even if no one else would understand it. The platform was called Veil Space, an encrypted corner of the internet where humans and supernaturals could interact anonymously, protected by layers of magical and digital security. It was technically illegal for humans to access, but Valerie had taught her the workarounds years ago. Tonight, Dana needed that protection, because what she was about to do could get her killed. She titled the post, "The Anomaly with No Kingdom." Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard, then began to type. I am the daughter of silence, born in a charity hospital where my mother bled alone, marked with a father's name that was never written, never spoken, never acknowledged. They say I'm an anomaly, blood that shouldn't exist, a bond that breaks every law. But I'm not the anomaly. The anomaly is a king who can love in secret but not in daylight, who can create life but not claim it, who can watch his child grow up fatherless and call it duty. To the silent king who knows exactly who I am not asking for your crown. I am not asking for your world. I am asking for the one thing you denied my mother until it killed her. I am asking you to speak my name, to acknowledge that I exist, to admit that your silence has consequences. You have 3 days. After that, I will speak for both of us. She didn't sign it, didn't need to. Anyone with access to court records would know exactly who she was talking about. And more importantly, Julian would know. Dana encrypted the post with a spell Valerie had taught her, one that would ensure it reached the court's private networks while keeping her location hidden. Then she hit publish. The response was immediate. Within an hour, the post had been viewed 3,000 times. Within 2 hours, 10,000. By dawn, it had spread through every supernatural forum, every underground network, every whispered conversation in the shadows between worlds. The humans who saw it thought it was fiction, a creative writing exercise. But the supernaturals knew better. Someone had just publicly challenged the Vampire King. Dana sat at her kitchen table, watching the view count climb, her heart hammering against her ribs. Valerie had gone home an hour ago, reluctantly, making Dana promise to call if anything happened. Now, alone in the pre-dawn quiet, Dana wondered if she'd just signed her own death warrant. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for 3 rings before answering. Hello? Silence. Then, a voice like winter frost. You're either very brave or very foolish. Dana's breath caught. She'd never heard his voice outside the court dinner, but she knew it instantly. Your Majesty. Don't. The word was sharp. Don't call me that. Not now. Then what should I call you? Dana's voice was steadier than she felt. Father seems premature. Julian feels too familiar. Your Majesty is apparently off the table. A long pause. You could have come to me directly. Would you have answered? Another silence. She had him there, and they both knew it. 3 days, Julian said finally. That's your ultimatum. That's my timeline. Dana stood, pacing to the window. The city was waking up. Early commuters, delivery trucks, the hum of ordinary life. You had 23 years. I think 3 days is generous. And after 3 days? What exactly are you threatening? Dana closed her eyes, thinking of her mother's letters, all those unsent words, all that swallowed grief. I'll tell them everything. The crossings, the secret garden, the white camellias. I'll show them the photograph of you and my mother looking at each other like the world was ending, which I suppose it was. She heard him inhale sharply. You have the photograph. I have everything. Every letter she wrote but never sent. Every diary entry about the king who promised forever and delivered silence. Every medical record showing how the severed bond destroyed her body piece by piece. Dana's voice hardened. I have enough truth to bury you, Julian. The only question is whether you'll bury yourself first. This isn't about truth. His voice was raw. This is about revenge. No. Dana's eyes burned. Revenge would be easy. Revenge would be publishing everything right now and watching your court tear you apart. This is about choice. I'm giving you the opportunity my mother never had, to choose truth over fear, to choose acknowledgement over silence, to prove that some part of you is still the man who loved her. The line went quiet for so long Dana thought he'd hung up. Then, barely a whisper. Where? What? Where do you want to meet? Julian's voice was heavy with resignation. Not the court, not your apartment, somewhere neutral. Somewhere we can talk without an audience. Dana hadn't expected this. She'd expected anger, threats, maybe even an attempt on her life. She hadn't expected capitulation. The Twilight Cafe, corner of 5th and Ashwood. It's in the border district, neutral territory. Tomorrow night, midnight. Midnight, Dana confirmed. And Dana... He stopped, as if her name was difficult to say. Come alone. If this is going to be honest, it needs to be private. Agreed. The call ended. Dana stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to dead air. Outside, the sun crested the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and shadow. In 12 hours she would sit across from the Vampire King, from her father, and one of them would have to surrender. She looked at the photograph on her desk. Julian and Lorie, young and doomed and desperately in love, her mother's handwriting on the back. The night we promised forever. I'm keeping your promise, Mom, Dana whispered, even if he couldn't. Across the city, Julian stood in his chambers, staring at the phone in his hand. Luke entered without knocking, taking in the king's expression. "You called her." "She called me. Publicly." Julian's laugh was bitter. "Through a blog post that half the supernatural world has already seen. She's giving me 3 days to acknowledge her, or she releases everything." "Everything?" "Letters, photographs, medical records." Julian sank into his chair. "Proof that I loved her mother. Proof that I abandoned them both. Proof that I'm exactly the coward she thinks I am." Luke studied him carefully. "Are you going to meet her?" "Tomorrow night. The Twilight Cafe." Julian looked up, and Luke saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there in decades. Fear. "I don't know how to face her, Luke. I don't know how to explain 20 years of silence." "Then don't explain it." Luke's voice was quiet. "Just apologize. Sometimes that's all a daughter needs to hear." Julian nodded slowly, turning back to the window. In the distance, the human district sprawled across the southern horizon, alive with morning light. Somewhere in those streets was a young woman who carried his blood, his legacy, and every mistake he'd ever made. In 3 days, the world would know the truth. But tomorrow night, he would have to face it first. The Twilight Cafe existed in the space between worlds, literally. Built on the border between the human district and the court's territory, it catered to those who didn't quite belong to either side. The lighting was dim, the booths private, and the staff knew better than to ask questions. It was perfect for conversations that could destroy kingdoms. Dana arrived 15 minutes early. She chose a booth in the back corner, positioning herself so she could see both entrances. Valerie had wanted to come, to wait outside as backup, but Dana had refused. This conversation needed to happen without witnesses, without safety nets. She ordered coffee she didn't drink and watched the door. Julian arrived at midnight exactly. He wore human clothes, dark jeans, a simple black coat, but there was no hiding what he was. He moved with the fluid grace of something that had perfected the art of being dangerous, and every head in the cafe turned to track him. He ignored them all, his eyes finding Dana immediately. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Father and daughter, king and anomaly. 2 people connected by blood and separated by everything else. Julian slid into the booth across from her. Up close, Dana could see the resemblance. The same sharp cheekbones, the same storm-gray eyes, the same stubborn set to the jaw. It was like looking at a ghost of herself rendered in winter and shadow. "You came," Dana said. "You knew I would." Julian's voice was quieter than she remembered, almost careful. "You wouldn't have called otherwise. I wasn't sure." Dana's fingers wrapped around her coffee mug. "Cowards are unpredictable." The word landed like a slap. Julian flinched but didn't argue. "You're right. I was a coward. I am a coward." "That's not—" Dana stopped, thrown by his immediate surrender. She'd prepared for defensiveness, for excuses, for him to hide behind duty and ancient law. She hadn't prepared for agreement. 23 years ago, I fell in love with your mother." Julian's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Lorie was everything the court said I couldn't have. Human. Artist. Free in ways I'd forgotten how to be. We met in a garden on the border. She was painting the night-blooming jasmine. I was supposed to be conducting a security inspection." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I kept inventing reasons to inspect that garden." Dana's throat tightened. "She wrote about you. In her journals. She called you the man made of moonlight." Something in Julian's expression cracked. "She always saw me better than I deserved." We had 5 months together. 5 months of stolen hours and impossible promises. I told her I'd find a way. That I'd change the laws, challenge the elders, make them understand. He paused. "And then they found out." "What happened?" The court elders summoned me, told me in explicit terms that my relationship with A.E. Human was not only illegal but treasonous, that if I continued, they would have Lorie arrested and tried for seduction of the crown, a capital offense. They gave me a choice: end it cleanly and she lives, or continue and watch her be executed for my sins. Dana's hands clenched. So you chose her life. I chose her survival. I broke things off without explanation. She deserved better. She deserved the truth, but I was terrified they'd find any excuse to hurt her. Julian's voice dropped. I didn't know she was pregnant. I swear to you, Dana, I didn't know. If I had... What? You would have done the same thing. Dana's words were sharp. Because that's what kings do, right? Sacrifice the people they love for the greater good. Yes? Julian didn't look away. That's exactly what I would have done. Because if the court had discovered she was carrying my child, they wouldn't have just killed her. They would have made it public. Made an example. Tortured her to prove that humans who dare to love above their station suffer for it. His jaw clenched. I loved her enough to let her go. I wasn't brave enough to love her loudly. The cafe hummed around them. Low conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of cups. Dana felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She died 12 years ago, Dana said quietly. The doctors said it was hemorrhagic fever, but I found texts that explained what really happened. The severed bond, when you walked away, it left a wound that never healed. Her body kept trying to reconnect to something that wasn't there anymore. It took 12 years, but it killed her. Julian's face went ashen. No, I didn't. I never meant. I know. Dana's voice cracked. That's what makes it worse. You didn't mean to kill her. You didn't mean to abandon me. You were just trying to protect us. But your protection felt exactly like rejection. Your silence felt exactly like shame. And my mother spent 12 years wondering if she'd imagine the love in your eyes. She didn't imagine it. Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it on the table between them. A white camellia, preserved in crystal. Perfect and eternal. She gave this to me the last night we were together, Julian said. She said camellias mean you're a flame in my heart. I've carried it for 23 years. Every day I looked at it and remembered the choice I made. The choice I'll regret until the day I turn to ash. Dana stared at the flower, this tiny piece of her mother frozen in time. Her vision blurred. I don't know how to forgive you, she whispered. I'm not asking you to. Julian's hand hovered near hers on the table, not quite touching. I'm asking you to let me try. To let me acknowledge you publicly. To claim you as my daughter. To give you the recognition your mother deserved. It will cost me politically. The elders will see it as weakness. I might lose the throne. And if you do? Julian met her eyes. Then I'll have finally chosen right. The words hung between them, heavy with promise and pain. Dana looked at this man, this king, this father, this coward who was trying to be brave, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. The Solstice Court Assembly, Dana said. It's in 5 days. That's when you'll acknowledge me? In front of everyone. Julian nodded. No more secrets. No more silence. Dana reached across the table and picked up the crystal camellia. It was warm in her palm, as if some echo of her mother's touch still lingered. Then we have 5 days to prepare, because when you stand up in that court and name me your daughter, they're going to come for both of us. Let them. Julian's voice was steel wrapped in sorrow. I've spent 3 centuries protecting my throne. It's time I protected my family instead. Dana slipped the camellia into her pocket and stood. Julian rose with her. They stood there, awkward and uncertain, Two people learning how to be father and daughter in the wreckage of everything that should have been. One more thing, Dana said. When you acknowledge me, use her name too. Tell them about Lorie. She deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote in your regrets. Julian's eyes shone. I will. I promise. Dana turned to leave, then paused. Without looking back, she said, "The man made of moonlight. That's what she called you. I thought it was romantic when I was a kid. Now I understand. Moonlight is beautiful, but it's just reflected sun. It's light that can't sustain life on its own." She finally looked at him. Don't be moonlight anymore. Be something real. She walked out into the night, leaving Julian alone with a promise he finally intended to keep. The council chamber was carved from obsidian, its walls reflecting centuries of blood oaths and broken promises. Julian stood at the head of the table, facing the 7 court elders who had ruled beside him, or perhaps over him, for the past 300 years. Luke stood at his right hand, silent and watchful. Elder Marcellus spoke first, his voice like gravel scraping bone. "This emergency session is highly irregular, Your Majesty. The Solstice Assembly is in 4 days. Whatever political maneuvering you're planning, I'm amending the succession laws." Julian's voice cut through the room like ice. Silence. Then Elder Seraphine leaned forward, her ancient eyes narrowing. "On what grounds?" Clause 73 allows for royal amendments in cases of previously unacknowledged kin. Julian placed a crystal tablet on the table. Luke had spent 2 days researching obscure legal precedents, finding the one loophole buried so deep in court law that no one had invoked it in 4 centuries. "I'm invoking it." "Unacknowledged kin?" Elder Thorne's laugh was sharp. "You have no heirs, Julian. You've made certain of that through 3 centuries of pristine isolation. I have a daughter." The words fell like stones into water. 23 years old, human-born, living in the East Quarter. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, the ancient elders suddenly animated with fury and disbelief. Elder Marcellus slammed his fist on the table, demanding silence. "This is treason," he hissed. "Breeding with a human violates every law we've upheld since the courts were founded. If what you're saying is true, you should be stripped of your crown and executed." "Then execute me." Julian's voice was calm, dangerously calm. "But first, you'll acknowledge my daughter as legitimate heir to the throne. Because if I fall, she rises. That's the law." Elder Seraphine stood slowly, her power crackling through the chamber. "You would destroy 3 centuries of rule for one mistake? One human child born of forbidden lust?" "I would destroy 3 centuries of lies." Julian met her gaze without flinching. "The child exists. Her blood resonates with mine. The royal resonance manifested in front of the entire court 4 days ago. You all saw it. You all know what it means. The only question is whether we acknowledge the truth or continue pretending our laws are more important than reality." "The law is reality," Elder Thorne snapped. "The law keeps us separate, keeps us safe, keeps the human world from discovering what we are and hunting us to extinction. The law also kept me from my daughter for 23 years, kept her mother isolated until the severed bond killed her, kept a child marked as fatherless because I was too afraid to challenge you." Julian's hands pressed flat against the table. "I'm done being afraid." Luke had never heard his king speak like this, not in 70 years of service. There was something different in Julian's posture, his voice, a kind of reckless certainty that came from having nothing left to lose. Elder Marcellus exchanged glances with the others. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, calculating. "If you acknowledge this girl publicly, you understand what will happen. The traditional bloodlines will revolt. The purists will demand your abdication. The humans will see it as proof that we've been infiltrating their society. This could trigger the war we've spent centuries avoiding. Or it could prove that we're not monsters. Julian straightened. That we're capable of evolution, of choosing truth over tradition. Pretty words. Seraphine's smile was cold. But words don't stop rebellions. Words don't prevent bloodshed. You're gambling everything. The stability of the court, the safety of our people, for one girl. For my daughter. Julian's voice softened. Her name is Dana. Dana Lorie Bowman. Her mother was an artist who painted jasmine and loved fearlessly despite knowing it would cost her everything. And yes, I'm gambling everything for her. Because that's what fathers should do. The elders went silent. Then Elder Thorne spoke, his voice heavy with, "Hey, resignation. You're serious about this?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Another long silence. Then Marcellus sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 800 years. "If we oppose you publicly, it will tear the court apart. If we support you, we validate everything we've claimed was forbidden." He stared at Julian with something between admiration and disgust. "You've cornered us beautifully." "I've given you a choice," Julian corrected. "Stand with truth or stand with fear. But choose quickly. The Solstice Assembly is in 4 days, and I will acknowledge Dana whether you support me or not." Elder Seraphine stood, her robes rustling like dead leaves. "Then we'll need those 4 days to prepare damage control, to contact the traditional families, to prevent this from becoming a massacre." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For the record, Your Majesty, I think you're destroying everything we've built. But I also think you stopped being our king the moment you fell in love with a human. You've just been pretending ever since." The other elders filed out, leaving only Julian and Luke in the obsidian chamber. Luke finally spoke. "That went better than expected." Julian laughed, a rough, desperate sound. "They're already planning how to remove me. You heard Marcellus. They'll let me acknowledge Dana, then use it as grounds for abdication. They'll let me have this moment of honesty, then strip me of everything." "Probably." Luke moved to stand beside him. "Does that change your mind?" "No." Julian pulled out his communication stone, pulling up the message he'd drafted 3 times and deleted twice. An email to Dana, carefully worded, explaining what he'd just done. "I sent her a message, told her about the succession amendment, told her that in 4 days the entire court will know she exists." He paused. "Told her I owe her acknowledgement, and her mother. And every year, I stayed silent." Luke read the message over his shoulder. Simple, honest, terrifying in its vulnerability. "She'll know what this costs you." "I hope so." Julian closed the stone. "Because if I'm going to lose my crown, I want her to understand it wasn't duty that took it from me. It was finally choosing right." Outside the council chamber, in the maze of corridors that connected the court's heart, a figure listened to every word through the stone walls. Elder Thorne's assistant, young and ambitious, pulled out her own communication device and began typing rapidly. The traditionalists needed to know. The purist families needed to prepare. Because in 4 days, the vampire king was going to commit political suicide. And if they moved quickly enough, they could make sure he didn't survive it. In her apartment across the city, Dana read Julian's message for the 5th time. "I owe you acknowledgement." 5 words that carried the weight of 23 years. She pressed her palm against the window, looking toward the obsidian towers in the distance. 4 days, Mom," she whispered. 4 days until he keeps the promise he should have made to you." She pulled out the crystal camellia Julian had given her, holding it up to the moonlight. The preserved flower glowed softly, eternal and fragile at once. Somewhere between those towers and this window, a war was beginning. And Dana Bowman was standing at its center, holding a dead woman's flower and a living man's regret. She just hoped they both survived what came next. The grand hall had never felt more like a tomb. Dana stood at the entrance, dressed in the formal black attire Valerie had helped her choose. Simple, dignified, defiant. Every vampire in the hall could smell her humanity, her otherness, her audacity for existing in a space that had been pure for centuries. She felt their eyes like knives against her skin. Luke Ashcroft waited just inside the doors. He'd been the one to send her the formal invitation, the one to guide her through the labyrinth of court protocol she'd need to survive the next hour. Now he offered her his arm, his expression carefully neutral. "Once you enter, there's no turning back," he said quietly. "The traditionalists will call for your execution, the moderates will demand exile, and the king—" He paused. "The king will risk everything. Are you ready?" Dana looked past him into the hall. Hundreds of vampires, ancient and powerful, gathered for the Solstice Court Assembly. At the far end, Julian sat on the obsidian throne, looking more like a prisoner than a king. Their eyes met across the distance and something passed between them. Recognition. Resolve. "I've been ready for 23 years, Dana said. They walked forward together. The crowd parted like a wound opening, whispers rising like poison. Human. Abomination. Mistake. Dana kept her chin high, her steps measured, her heart a war drum in her chest. She could feel the blood resonance starting already, a faint warmth beneath her skin that grew stronger with each step toward the throne. Julian stood as she approached. The gesture silenced the hall instantly. "Members of the court," Julian's voice carried through the chamber, formal and absolute. "I have called this assembly to address a matter of succession and truth. For 3 centuries, I have ruled with the understanding that my bloodline would end with me. That understanding was a lie." The hall erupted in murmurs. Elder Marcellus raised his hand for silence, his face carved from displeasure. Julian continued, his gaze never leaving Dana. 23 years ago, I broke our most sacred law. I fell in love with a human woman named Lorie Bowman, an artist, a dreamer, someone who saw past the crown and the fear and found something in me worth loving." His voice cracked slightly. "I was a coward. When the court discovered our relationship, I was given a choice: end it or watch her be executed. I chose her survival. I walked away. I convinced myself it was duty." Dana stopped 10 feet from the throne, Luke stepping aside to let her stand alone. "What I didn't know," Julian said, and now his voice was breaking entirely, "was that Lorie was pregnant. That she raised our daughter alone in the human district. That she died 12 years ago from complications caused by the bond I severed. That my silence, my protection, killed the woman I loved and abandoned the child I didn't know existed." He stepped down from the throne, walking toward Dana. The hall held its breath. "This is Dana Lorie Bowman." Julian's hand trembled as he gestured toward her. "My daughter. Marked by the royal resonance, carrier of my blood and her mother's courage. She risked execution to speak a truth I should have proclaimed decades ago." He stopped directly in front of her, and the crimson aura flared between them, visible to every vampire in the hall. Undeniable. "I was a coward then. I choose to be honest now." "This is treason!" A voice rang out from the traditional faction. Lord Castellan, ancient and bitter, stood with a contingent of purist vampires behind him. "You admit to violating our most fundamental law." "I admit to loving someone." Julian's voice cut through the accusation. "I admit to creating life. I admit to being too afraid to claim it, but I will not admit that my daughter is a mistake. She exists. Her blood calls to mine, and I name her my heir." The hall exploded. Shouts of outrage, calls for abdication, the scrape of chairs as alliances shifted and broke. Through it all, Dana stood frozen, watching this ancient king destroy his kingdom for her. Elder Seraphine rose, her power silencing the chaos. You understand what you're doing, Julian. By naming a half-human heir, you invalidate every pure bloodline in this court. You threaten the very foundation of our society. Then our foundation was built on fear, not strength. Julian turned to face the elders. I have ruled for 3 centuries by pretending I was something I'm not. Perfectly controlled, perfectly isolated, perfectly bound by laws written by vampires too afraid to evolve. But I am not perfect. I am a father who failed his daughter, a lover who abandoned his mate, a king who chose a crown over courage. He looked back at Dana, and his eyes shone with unshed tears. I can't undo 23 years of absence, but I can acknowledge the truth. Dana is my daughter. Lorie Bowman was the woman I loved. And if admitting that costs me this throne, then the throne was never mine to begin with. Dana felt something break open inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but witness. He was finally speaking the words her mother had died waiting to hear. Your Majesty. Dana's voice rang clear through the hall. She'd planned this moment with Valerie, rehearsed it a dozen times. Now, standing in the eye of the storm, she spoke from her heart instead. You left my mother to protect her. You stayed silent to keep me safe. I understand that now. But silence and safety are not the same as love. Love is this. She gestured at the chaos around them. Love is standing in front of your entire world and saying, I choose her. Love is risking everything for truth. Her voice softened. My mother never got that. She died believing you were ashamed of her, of me, of what we represented. Julian's face crumpled. I was never ashamed. I was terrified. I know. Dana took one step forward. The blood resonance pulsed brighter and gasps rippled through the crowd. But I'm not my mother. I don't need your protection. I need your acknowledgement. So acknowledge me, not as your heir, not as a political statement, as your daughter. Say my name like it matters. Julian dropped to one knee. The king of the vampire court, 300 years old, kneeling before a 23-year-old human girl. Dana Lorie Bowman, daughter of Lorie Bowman and Julian Crowe, carrier of 2 worlds, proof that love is stronger than law. His voice broke. You are my daughter, and I am so sorry I wasn't brave enough to say that sooner. The hall fell into stunned silence. Then Lord Castellan moved forward, his face twisted with rage. This is an abomination. If the king will not uphold our laws, then we must remove... His words cut off as Luke Ashcroft stepped between him and Julian, hand on his blade. You'll have to go through me first. More vampires moved, some toward Julian in support, others toward Castellan in alliance. The court was fracturing in real time, centuries of unity shattering over one girl's existence. Dana looked at Julian, still kneeling, still vulnerable, still choosing her despite everything it cost. She extended her hand. He stared at it for a long moment, then took it. The blood resonance exploded between them, crimson light flooding the hall like dawn breaking. Every vampire in the chamber felt it, the raw power of acknowledged blood, of truth finally spoken, of a bond that refused to be denied. Stand up, Dana said quietly. You don't kneel to me, you stand beside me. That's what fathers do. Julian rose, hand still clasped in hers, and faced the fracturing court together. Father and daughter, king and heir. 2 people who had finally found each other in the wreckage of everything that tried to keep them apart. The letter arrived 3 days after the court assembly, slipped under Dana's door at dawn. No signature, just 2 words in elegant script. Thank you. Dana sat at her kitchen table, staring at those words until her coffee went cold. The city outside her window was different now. Or maybe she was. The court assembly had been broadcast through every supernatural network, analyzed in every forum, debated in every shadow. She'd become famous overnight. The human girl who broke a king. The anomaly who shattered 3 centuries of law. She wasn't sure how she felt about any of it. Valerie arrived with groceries and concern. You need to eat something that isn't coffee and existential dread. I'm fine. You're not. Valerie started, unpacking food Dana didn't remember asking for. You've been staring at that letter for 2 hours. What does it say? Thank you. Dana finally looked up. No context, no explanation, just thank you. From him? Dana nodded. After the assembly, Julian had been swept into emergency council sessions, damage control, negotiations with the fractured factions. She hadn't seen him since they'd stood together in the grand hall, hands clasped, the blood resonance burning between them like a declaration of war. He kept his promise, Dana said quietly. He acknowledged me, named my mother, risked everything. She traced the words on the paper. So why does it still feel incomplete? Valerie sat across from her, violet eyes sharp with understanding. Because acknowledgement isn't the same as relationship. He said your name in front of the court. Now you have to figure out what that actually means. Dana's phone buzzed. A notification from Veilspace, her blog post, the one that started everything, now had over 2 million views. The comments section had become a war zone of opinions about hybrid rights, court reform, the nature of love across species barriers. People were using her mother's name, talking about Lorie Bowman like she mattered, like she'd existed. She would have hated this, Dana whispered. The attention, the politics. She just wanted to paint Jasmine and live quietly. She also wanted you to know your father. Valerie's voice was gentle. She wrote that letter. She left you those clues. Maybe she knew that one day, you'd be brave enough to do what she couldn't. Dana pulled out the crystal camellia, setting it between them on the table. He carried this for 23 years. Every day, he looked at it and remembered. That's what he said. She turned it slowly, watching light refract through the preserved petals. Is that love or just guilt? Maybe both. Maybe it doesn't matter. Valerie leaned forward. Dana, you don't have to forgive him. You don't have to build a relationship. You don't owe him anything just because he finally did the right thing. I know. Dana closed her hand around the flower. But I want to. Is that weak? That's human. Valerie smiled sadly. You spent 23 years without a father. Now you have one who's trying. Badly, awkwardly, but trying. It's okay to want that, even if it's complicated. Dana's laptop chimed. An email from Julian. She opened it with trembling fingers. Dana, I don't know the protocol for this. I've ruled for 3 centuries, but fatherhood is uncharted territory. Luke says I should give you space. The elders say I should focus on damage control. But I keep thinking about what you said. Fathers stand beside their daughters. I'm trying to figure out how to do that when we're still strangers. There's a community forum next week. Human supernatural integration. They asked me to speak about the assembly. I declined. Then I thought, maybe you should speak instead. Your voice matters. More than mine in this. Let me know. Or don't. I'm learning that sometimes silence is answer enough. Dana read it twice, 3 times. Then she started typing. Julian, I'll speak at the forum. Not for you. For my mother. For every hybrid kid who grows up thinking they're a mistake. For everyone who's been told their existence violates someone else's comfort. But after, maybe we could talk. Just talk. No court. No politics. Just 2 people trying to figure out what family means when it starts 23 years late. Dana. She hit send before she could overthink it. Valerie watched her carefully. What did you say? That I'll speak at the forum. Dana stood, moving to her mother's paintings lined against the wall. Watercolors of gardens and night-blooming flowers, soft colors that had grown bolder over time. And that maybe we could talk after. Just talk. That's brave. That's terrifying. Dana pulled out one painting in particular. Jasmine climbing a stone wall. Moonlight filtering through leaves. Her mother had painted it the year Dana was born. She'd always wondered why the moonlight looked sad. Now she understood. But my mother spent 12 years waiting for him to be brave. I think I can manage one conversation. She pulled out her phone and called the forum organizers. Yes, she'd speak. Yes, she'd tell her story. Yes, she'd stand in front of cameras and microphones and say the words that needed saying. I am Dana Bowman. My mother was Lorie Bowman. My father is Julian Crowe. And my existence is not an apology. The forum coordinator sounded shocked, grateful, slightly terrified. Dana hung up and turned to Valerie. I need help writing a speech. What kind of speech? Dana looked at the painting, at the sad moonlight her mother had captured. The kind that says silence isn't protection, that visibility isn't weakness, that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is exist loudly. She picked up the crystal camellia again. My mother existed quietly for 23 years. She made herself small to survive. I'm not going to do that. Valerie grinned, something fierce and proud in her expression. Now that's the Dana I know. They spent the afternoon drafting and revising, Dana's words tumbling out faster than she could type them. About her mother, about the severed bond, about growing up fatherless in a world that treated hybrid children like contamination, about Julian's cowardice and his eventual courage, about the difference between being acknowledged and being accepted. When they finished, Dana sat back, staring at the screen. This is going to make things worse before they get better. Probably. Valerie saved the document. But you're not responsible for making things comfortable. You're responsible for telling the truth. Dana's phone buzzed. Julian's response. After the forum, there's a park in the Human District, where I met your mother. I'd like to show it to you, if you're ready. Dana typed back. I'll never be ready. But I'll be there anyway. She looked at Valerie, at the speech on her screen, at her mother's paintings surrounding her like blessings. For 23 years she'd been invisible. The fatherless girl, the anomaly, the mistake nobody wanted to name. Now she was about to step into the brightest light possible and claim every inch of space she deserved. One conversation at a time, Dana whispered, echoing her own words to Julian. One truth at a time. Outside, the sun set over the divided city, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. And in the obsidian tower across town, Julian stood at his window, holding a letter he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. A letter to the daughter he was still learning how to love. A letter that said what the court assembly couldn't. I'm sorry. I'm trying. I'm here. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. In 3 days, they'd meet in the park where he'd fallen in love with Lorie, where he'd made promises he'd failed to keep. This time, he'd make different promises, smaller ones, honest ones. One conversation at a time, one truth at a time. It was a beginning. The park existed in that liminal space between worlds, tucked into the border district where human and vampire territories blurred. Ancient magnolia trees stretched toward the sky, their branches heavy with white blooms that filled the air with a scent like memory and longing. Julian stood beneath the oldest tree, its trunk gnarled with centuries, and waited. Dana arrived as the sun touched the horizon, that golden hour when day surrendered to night. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a sweater the color of twilight, her mother's silver locket around her neck, the one she'd found in the box of letters. Inside was a pressed camellia and a lock of hair she suspected was Julian's, though she'd never asked. He turned as she approached, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Father and daughter, king and heir. Two people still learning how to be both. "You came," Julian said quietly. "I said I would." Dana stopped a few feet away, maintaining careful distance. "Is this it? Where you met her?" "Right here." Julian gestured to the magnolia. "She was sitting on that bench, sketching the flowers. I was supposed to be inspecting the border security. Instead, I stood there for 20 minutes watching her work. When she finally noticed me, she didn't seem afraid. Just curious." He smiled, sad and soft. "She asked if I wanted to see what she was drawing. It was terrible. She'd gotten the petals all wrong. But she laughed about it. Said magnolias were too perfect to capture. That beauty like that should stay wild." Dana moved to the bench, running her fingers over the weathered wood. She could almost see them, her mother young and alive, Julian not yet weighted by centuries of regret. Two people who didn't know they were doomed. "I spoke at the forum yesterday," Dana said. "Did you watch?" "Every word." Julian's voice was rough. "You were extraordinary. Brave in ways I've never managed." Dana had spoken for 40 minutes. About her mother's life, about the cost of silence, about growing up marked as fatherless while her father ruled from an obsidian tower, about the difference between being protected and being claimed. The crowd had been split. Some outraged, some moved, all forced to confront uncomfortable truths. By the end, she'd been shaking but standing, visible.
"The traditionalists are calling for my exile," Dana said. "Lord Castellan filed a formal complaint. Luke is handling it." Julian moved closer, still maintaining that careful distance. "The moderates are actually rallying. Turns out there are more hybrids than anyone admitted, children born in secret, hidden in human districts, raised to believe they were mistakes. Your speech gave them permission to exist." Dana's throat tightened. "My mother would have hated the attention. Your mother would have been proud." Julian pulled something from his coat pocket. A small silver locket, twin to the one Dana wore. "She gave me this the last night we were together. Inside is a painting she did, miniature, barely an inch wide. I've never shown it to anyone." He opened it. Inside was a tiny watercolor of two hands clasped together, one pale and one darker, their fingers intertwined. Beneath it, in Lorie's delicate script, "Forever is a choice we make every day." Dana stared at the painting, at her mother's hope rendered in brushstrokes. "She believed you'd choose forever." "I did choose forever. Just not the way she meant." Julian's voice cracked. "I chose to carry her in every decision, every moment of silence, every time I looked at that camellia and remembered. But that's not the same as choosing her loudly. Choosing us." He closed the locket. "I want to give this to you. It's yours by right." Dana took it carefully, feeling the weight of 23 years in her palm. Two lockets now. Two pieces of a love story that had ended before she could remember it beginning. "What do I do with all this grief that isn't mine?" "You carry it." Julian's eyes shone. "And you let me help carry yours. That's what family does, we share the weight." "We're not family yet." Dana's words were gentle but firm. "We're related. We're connected. But family is built, not declared. It takes time. Then we have time." Julian gestured to the magnolia. "This tree is 300 years old. It was here when I was born. It'll be here long after I'm gone. Your mother used to say it was proof that beautiful things endure." He looked at Dana. "I'd like to meet you here. Once a month. Or once a week. However often you can stand my company. Just to talk." To learn who you are. To let you learn who I'm trying to become. Dana considered this. The man before her was still mostly stranger, 3 centuries of history she didn't know, choices she couldn't understand, a whole existence that had nothing to do with her. But he was also the person who'd knelt before the entire court. Who'd risked his throne. Who was standing here, vulnerable and waiting, offering what he could. Once a month, Dana said. To start. We'll see how it goes. Relief flooded Julian's face. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'm going to ask difficult questions. I'm going to make you talk about her, really talk, not just the romantic parts. I need to know who she was beyond the tragedy. Beyond the loss. Dana's voice strengthened. And I'm going to tell you about growing up without you. The birthday parties where kids asked about my dad. The school forms where I had to write unknown. The nights my mother cried and I didn't understand why. You're going to hear all of it. I want to. Julian's voice was steady. I deserve to hear all of it. Dana opened her mother's locket, looking at the pressed camellia inside. Then she opened Julian's, looking at the tiny painting. 2 pieces of the same story, separated for 23 years. She held them side by side, and something in her chest loosened. She painted you holding her hand, Dana said softly. Even after you left, she still believed in forever. I'm trying to believe in it too. Julian moved closer, close enough that the blood resonance began to warm between them. Not the forever we lost. The forever we might still build. If you'll let me try. Dana looked at him, really looked. At the ancient vampire who'd finally chosen courage. At the father who was learning how to love 23 years too late. At the man her mother had seen something good in, despite everything that tried to prove her wrong. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Brief. Awkward. The first hug they'd ever shared. Julian stood frozen for a moment, then carefully, so carefully, hugged her back. When they pulled apart, both had tears on their faces. Next month, Dana said. Same tree. And bring stories about her. Real ones. The messy, complicated, human ones. Next month, Julian agreed. I promise. Dana turned to leave, then paused. Julian? She called you the man made of moonlight. But I think you're finally learning to be the sun. It's harder. It burns. But it sustains life. She walked away through the magnolia grove, leaving Julian standing beneath the ancient tree where he'd fallen in love and learned to fail and was now learning, finally, to repair. He looked up at the white blooms overhead, thinking of Lorie's laugh, Dana's courage, and the impossible gift of a second chance. He pulled out his phone and typed a message. Thank you for existing. For being brave enough to demand I face the truth. Your mother would be so proud. I'm proud too. See you next month. Your father. He hesitated before adding those last 2 words, then sent it anyway. Across the city, Dana read the message and smiled through tears. She typed back, see you next month. Your daughter. 2 words that meant everything. In the Magnolia Park, where love had begun and broken and was now slowly mending, the ancient trees bloomed eternal. Proof that beautiful things endure. Proof that even after 23 years of silence, some promises could still be kept. One conversation at a time. One truth at a time. One choice at a time. It was enough. Dana's mother died waiting for acknowledgement. Don't make this channel die waiting for your subscription. Like. Subscribe. And if you haven't yet, comment why, because at this point, I'm just confused about what you're waiting for.